Welcome to the February 2nd, 2025 episode of The Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham. Now, before we get to talking about Donald Trump's tariffs, 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, which is the subject of this show, I should address the elephant in the room. If you saw any of my shows last week, you know that I had the video turned off. And the reason why is probably pretty plain. I had a bicycling accident a week ago, used my face to stop. It's but not recommended as a rule. And now I'm just healed up enough that I was hoping to wait a couple more days, but Trump trumped me, I'm afraid. So we're going to get into this right away. Before we do, want to give you the information where you can contact us with questions or comments. For email, it's the Energy Show, energy with an I, not a Y, at gmail.com. And text is 587-330-5757. So we're going to talk about the executive order that Donald Trump released yesterday, setting off a trade war with Canada and Mexico. And Canada has already announced its retaliation package, $155 billion. And we'll get into that in a little more detail in a bit. The Wall Street Journal is calling this the dumbest trade war in history. And I have to tell you, I agree. And we're going to have Ed Hurst, who's an energy economist from the University of Houston, on for both segments, one for electricity, one for oil and gas, to talk about what some of the implications are of those tariffs. So let's first of all get to his claim. And this is very interesting. He claims that the fentanyl, the opioid, is flooding through the northern border into the United States, as are illegal immigrants. And he also says that the huge trade balance that we have, the trade deficit that the U.S. has with Canada, means that they're subsidizing us and we're taking unfair advantage. We're ripping them off. So let me address some of those. First of all, Canada, in its press release yesterday, said that a whole whopping 19 pounds of fentanyl had been seized along the Canadian border last year. I don't know, maybe somebody had it in their backpack. I mean, that's how little it is compared to the amount that's coming in from Mexico, which is, thousands and thousands of pounds that they seized. Never mind what they didn't. It's a pittance. So it's trumped up, if you will. The other thing that I did is I went and looked at the list of countries that have a trade deficit with the U.S. and Canada sits about ninth. The total for the U.S. is $1.1 trillion trade deficit. We're $50 billion of that. I mean, I think there was countries in there like Ireland that had that where the deficit was actually higher, and China, of course, I think was 350 billion. So they picking on Canada when there are, why didn't you go pick on Ireland? Is just again, it's trumped up, and I don't want to speculate on why Donald Trump is picking this, as the Wall Street Journal pretty much reflected most Canadians' views. So I want to get into what was actually in the executive order, because this is very interesting. It's 25% on all goods, 10% on energy. Now, how do you define energy? It's actually defined in the executive order as crude oil, natural gas and natural gas liquids, refined petroleum products, uranium, coal, biofuels, geothermal heat, and critical minerals. And the question naturally arises, where's electricity? Why isn't that mentioned? It appears to be deliberately exempted or excluded, but nobody's really been paying attention to this. And I'll be getting into this a little bit with Ed Hurst in a moment. But before I do, I just want to show you some slides that we have put together with some data on trade in electricity between Canada and the US. So here we go. This is information that's taken from the Canadian Energy Regulator, which handles all of the energy statistics for Canada. And look at those flows. You can see very high a large amount of electricity flowing from Quebec into the northeast coast, the independent system operator for New England, and also this independent system operator for New York. So those two regions are very dependent on Ontario and Quebec, and to a lesser extent, Newfoundland and Labrador and New Brunswick. All Canadian provinces trade electricity with at least one state. So you can see Manitoba, which also has enormous hydro capabilities that serves the Midwest. And then on the West Coast, where I live, British Columbia, another hydro province, has a very significant trade with the West Coast of the United States. And what that means is they flow both ways. This is not just us selling to the United States. The the North American electricity grid is very tightly integrated, and we trade electricity somewhat a little bit east and west, but mostly north and south with our American cousins. This will give you an idea of what the regions look like. You see the ISO, two New York and New England ISOs, and then PJM, which is a very big regional trading organization, the Midwest and the West. And that's essentially where Canadian electricity exports go. Now, this is interesting. This is actually imports into Canada. And look at, and it's 2019 data. The CER didn't have any later data posted on its website. So I pulled this one down. But at that time, and probably things haven't changed that much, British Columbia imported 84% of all the US electricity that flowed into Canada. Alberta, 8%, Manitoba, 4%, and then you see the smaller projectiles. So the importation of electricity generally comes from almost entirely from Western Canada. And here you can see the proportion of exports and imports. We've had a couple of dry years up in Canada, and so what that means in practical terms is that the hydro dams are not producing as much. Their generation is down. So you can see in 2020, 2021, 2022, very strong years, lots of exports, not a lot of imports. And then over the last 2 years, as our generation declined, we're exporting less and importing more. My point here is no one could look at this graph and say that Canada is ripping off the US. I mean, essentially, you can see it's more of a symbiotic kind of relationship where we depend on each other. And so as our exports to the US declined, the US stepped up and sent more electricity to Canada. We're joined today by our old friend, energy economist Ed Hurst of the University of Houston, who I've interviewed many times. And he's going to talk about electricity and oil and gas and the implications of Donald Trump's executive order and the trade war. So welcome to the Energy Show, Ed.
Thank you, Markham.
Look, one of the things that's very clear when you look at the data around electricity flows between the two countries is how tightly integrated the power grids are all across Canada. Every province trades with at least one state, and there's a lot of electricity that goes from Eastern Canada into the Northeast coast, into New England, into New York, and it appears that electricity was not included in the definition of energy that Donald Trump signed in his executive order. Why do you think that might be?
Well, the Northeast and in particular some of the mid-continent states, for example, coming down through Michigan, are very dependent upon the Canadian electricity. The Northeast has been retiring coal plants, natural gas plants, and hydroelectric dams. So what comes out of Quebec, what comes out of Ontario, very necessary to power the United States. You know, if he put a tariff on this, then the electricity costs, which are already really high in New England, would jump that much more. This would not be pleasant for the consumers in the New England states.
Yeah, we saw what happened a couple of years ago with it was Storm Uri in Texas. And what happens when you lose power? And there were a couple hundred people died. And we know that the North American Electricity Reliability Corporation, NERC, which is responsible for reliability in all throughout North America, and it has said very clearly that this winter North American grids, particularly American grids, are in danger of blackouts, of outages. And if Canada, and the reason I bring this up is even though Donald Trump may have excluded it from his executive order, that doesn't preclude Canada from using it as a counter to his tariffs. Am I correct?
Yes, so a retaliatory measure would be an export tax placed upon the electricity coming to the US. And you're right about the vulnerability of these grids. MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, extends from Lake Charles, Louisiana, on the coast, all the way to Manitoba. And MISO is perhaps the most vulnerable grid across the nation, give or take ERCOT in Texas. MISO is able to draw electricity from PJM, the Southwest Power Pool, if the weather doesn't affect them too badly, the others. We have apparently another polar vortex scheduled to come rolling through here February 14, 15, or 16. It could be as bad as the one that we had in February of 2021. If so, then everybody's going to have to do their job to prevent blackouts across a large part of our nations.
Now we're going to talk about oil and gas, primarily oil, because that's the bulk of what we send south of the border. And this is probably a good time to discuss the retaliatory package that Canada announced yesterday. And it's $155 billion worth of goods but in the first phase, it includes 30 billion, and it is effective February 4th. And you can see that it's very targeted to specific states: orange juice, Florida. There's peanut butter, alcohol, coffee, appliances, apparel, footwear, motorcycles, cosmetics, and pulp and paper. So the Canadian government has taken a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer to this issue. Then that's going to be followed by a 21-day consultation period, and I'm sure the government is, waiting to see what Trump will do. Because I should have mentioned when I was discussing his executive order, there's a clause in there that says if Canada or Mexico retaliates with tariffs, then the United States will up the tariffs or add new ones. So this could be a tit for tat. It could go very quickly. It could get tit for tat and escalate quite significantly. So I think the government wants a little bit of a cooling off period. We'll see what they do, see what we need, where it needs to go. But then when we get into phase two, it'll be $125 billion, and it'll include vehicles, so big in Ontario, steel and aluminum, all industry across the country, fruits, vegetables, aerospace products, meat, and dairy. One of the things, and it's very interesting, is that no mention of energy, not explicitly, but in her comments, the Minister Jolie, Melanie Jolie, Minister of Foreign Affairs, who sort of led the charge on this one, said, and I'm quoting here, tariffs will upend production at U.S. auto assembly plants and oil refineries, raise costs to American consumers at gas pumps and grocery stores. So you're not talking about interrupting the flow of oil down to refineries and raising the cost of gasoline, which American consumers are very sensitive to, unless you plan to include oil at a minimum in your next phase two of the retaliatory package. So what I wanted to do is provide you with a little bit of context, and we'll get back to the graphs in a moment, and then we'll have the other interview with Ed Hurst. Okay, the slide you're looking at again comes from the Canadian Energy Regulator, and it's crude oil exports by type and province. Because if there are going to be either an export tax or some kind of means of which would raise the cost to the refiners, then um, you, there might be some other method that would be used to restrict exports. But look who would be hurt the most. Alberta sells at this point almost 4 million barrels a day of oil to American refineries, and most of it is heavy crude, probably about 80%. Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Newfoundland and Labrador also export, but far, far less than Alberta. So we understand why Premier Danielle Smith has been insistent that oil and gas not be included as part of the retaliation plan. But the Canadian government is taking a Team Canada approach, and everybody has to feel the pain, including Alberta. So where does that oil go? And this is very interesting. Pad 2 is the American Midwest, and that's roughly today, I think it's 2.8 million barrels. This graph is for 2024. So Pad 1 is the Northeast. There's not much there. Pad 3 is the U.S. Gulf Coast, which is the second biggest destination. Fair amount actually going to California and the West Coast in Pad 5, because a lot of their refineries are set up for the heavy oil, because they used to be a very large producer but don't produce as much now. And actually a surprising amount in Pad 4, which is the Rocky Mountains. Here are the percentage of imports by the pad number. And I should point out PAD means Petroleum Administration for Defense Districts. That's an American term that they use when discussing their regions of the country from an oil point of view. So in this case, look at that. The Midwest PAD, which is, again, almost 3 million barrels a day, 100% of their imports come from Canada. Rocky Mountain, again, about 500,000, maybe less than that, maybe 300,000 or 400,000, 100%. In the East Coast, Gulf Coast, and the West Coast, on the other hand, the Canadian imports make up a much smaller proportion of the total imports. So if you were sitting in Ottawa thinking about how you wanted to send a message to Donald Trump and how you wanted to make it very pointed, either raising the cost of Canadian crude to the Midwest, or slowing or stopping the flow of that oil to the Midwest, would be pretty darn painful. And I would imagine would engender quite a backlash amongst consumers and American politicians. Now, who they'd be mad at is an open question, Trump or Canada. But Trump did start this, so I guess Canada would have a good leg to stand on. And this is something that, again, getting back, is the economies of Canada and the U.S. are tightly integrated. The energy systems are even more integrated. And okay, so let's move on from electricity. I'm very interested to know what you think about Trump's intentions on oil and gas. And I had an energy economist, Dr. Chris Bataille, on here last week, telling us about how dependent on Canadian oil American refineries are, especially in Pad 2 in the Midwest, 2.8 million barrels a day. And even some of, the U.S. Gulf Coast, more Canadian oil is going down there. So what if there is tariffs on oil, 10%, what does that do? What are the implications?
Well, that will be felt instantly through Pad 2, through the mid-continent region. I expect that those refineries don't have any alternatives other than the Canadian crude. They're configured to process the heavier crude that comes out of Canada. Some of it's blended, of course, with the shale oil to lighten it up a little bit. But keep in mind that since the shale plays kicked off in North Dakota and in Wyoming and Colorado, any of the pipes that we had on the Gulf Coast that were taking oil up now are turned around to take it down. And we can't change that. The refineries have been under a huge amount of pressure. simply because demand is down globally. They're old. Most of the refineries are easily 50, 60, 70 years old. One on the Gulf Coast, the Lyondell refinery, over 100 years old, is closing down. It's configured to process Canadian crude or Venezuelan crude or heavy Saudi crude. Uh, Nobody sees a profit in putting 800 million back into it just to trade pennies on the gallon. So the consumers in the mid-continent and PADD 2 are going to pay the price. Some of the Canadian crude that comes down to the Gulf Coast might not actually stop in the United States. It may just go ahead and be exported out. There could be some trading. I don't know how the tariff may or may not work in terms of just having a throughput of Canadian crude. But the U.S. consumer is going to bear the brunt of this. You know, there's a conceit, a fiction that perhaps increasing the cost of this crude to the U.S. might spur domestic drilling, but that's not going to happen.
So I guess there are three parties here who can either pay or share the cost, the increased cost. That would be the consumer, as you mentioned. That would be the refineries, who are the customers of the Canadian producers, and the Canadian producers themselves. And is there any chance that there might be negotiations between refineries and producers to share costs, or do the producers just say, "Sorry, this is this is the price. We've had to adjust it because of the new tariff, and pay it or don't pay it"?
Well, the tariffs are paid at the import point, and so and those would be paid by the refiners. If the refiners are unable to pay it because their margins are already too tight, then it's going to be up to the producers as to whether or not they want to lower their price to accommodate that. But if the refiners do pay, then that's indicative that indicates that the consumer is going to take it on the chin and in the wallet. And some of the economic consultancies will probably have this all figured out by next Friday, because it depends upon the price elasticity of demand for gasoline, for diesel, for oil. And the more inelastic the demand is, and in particular, it's very inelastic for consumers, the more you would expect the consumer to have to pick up the all of the cost of the tariffs.
What might be the fallout of all of this, Ed? And there's a lot of speculation that really this is bluster from the president, and he'll soon back down, and he'll look for a win. Give him a win, and he'll walk away, and he'll be happy. That's the way he approaches negotiations. But what if this drags on? Like, what if it's 2 weeks, 4 weeks? What if it's 3 months, 6 months? What are some of the consequences that we might see?
Well, the U.S. consumer doesn't have many alternatives to gasoline and diesel processed from other oil, if you will, lighter oil. The U.S. is full of light sweet oil, but the refineries that use the Canadian oil can't readily shift. It would cost millions and millions of dollars for them to change their configurations. So that's not going to happen. If we go down the path of tit for tat, retaliatory measures, then this is going to have a recessionary impact on both nations, well, on all three. The North American Free Trade Agreement, which then was renegotiated under Trump 1.0, was designed to lower barriers, to keep them away. And we can integrate the economies. We've done a magnificent job. The automakers in the U.S., more than 40% of their production is back and forth across the borders. The computer companies, the steel mills, the manufacturing firms. This is going to throw a wrench into our integrated economies, much more so than just tagging us with higher fuel costs. And a recessionary impact here would be unavoidable in just a couple of months' time.
Let's talk about the alternate sources of supply for those refineries that are already configured for heavy crude. So we should point out that globally there's about 10.5 million barrels a day of heavy crude refining capacity. 5.5 million barrels a day of that is in the United States. And a lot of it, of course, is up in the Midwest around Chicago and around Detroit, and some in the California, I think, probably about Canada sells 500,000 barrels a day into there. A lot of it is down in the U.S. Gulf Coast. Okay, so there are competitors. I mean, it's not like Canada doesn't have competitors. There are all the Latin American producers, like Venezuela and Brazil and Colombia and Ecuador. There are some Middle East producers, like Saudi Arabia produces heavy. Is there any chance that the Canadian producers might actually lose market share because other competitive producers, like for instance, Saudi Arabia, they have idle production. And if some of that is heavy crude, they could put it back into production and ship send it by ship down to the U.S. Gulf Coast. Maybe the Canadian producers lose market share.
That's entirely likely. We get about 500,000 barrels of heavy crude from Saudi Arabia every day. So it wouldn't be very difficult for them to increase that flow. But then where does the Canadian crude go? Is it pushed back? Is it deeply discounted and just run to a pipeline down here and then spread out across the global market? The consumers throughout the mid-continent region, if those refineries are so squeezed that they wind up closing down and find themselves unable to pass along their tariffs, and their margins would suffer dramatically, they're not going to stay in business if they're losing money. The crude by rail that is still operating across the shale plays would be a relatively easy way for refineries here on the Gulf Coast to fill those tankers with on the return with diesel and gasoline. So it's possible, but again, that increases the cost to the consumer. So $5 a barrel of transport right back up into the mid-continent is going to go right to the pump.
Final question, Ed. It seems to me that what we've got here is a Trump's specialty, which is chaos. He creates chaos and then he manages through chaos and tries to bully his negotiating partner, Canada, Mexico in this case, into concessions. Okay, so the industry, by the same token, has always said we crave stability. So how long can this instability that Trump has created go on before we have some really severe consequences inside the oil and gas system that's been set up for decades?
Well, I think you'll find a lot of resilience in the oil and gas refinery distribution side. If the refiners that are picking up the Canadian crude can't pass through the tariffs, and the Canadian producers don't lower the cost, they're going to close. And so, but there are a couple of ways. There's the finesse out of this. The Canadian government could push to devalue the Canadian dollar. That could offset the impact of the tariffs. But I think really we need to look beyond the energy side. If we get into a recessionary period here, that's going to, of course, lower demand for refined products just across the board, and that will work to drive the price down as well. That's the biggest issue. And I think what we're going to see is a drop in the stock market, especially the U.S. market. It's been up 40% over the last 2 years of the Biden administration, 20 and 20 plus. A lot of the domestic manufacturers, upon Trump's election and first mention of these punitive tariffs against Mexico and Canada, began bringing in their inventory, moving it in across the borders right now. That's going to have an impact on their fourth quarter earnings and their year-end reports. Now, it will reduce their profits dramatically. That's going to be reflected in their share price. And so my expectation is without a ceasefire in the tariff war, these earnings reports that will start coming out in the next 3 weeks to 4 weeks are going to drive the stock market down. President Trump is all about the stock price and the stock market. And I expect a severe recession and the threat of a severe recession, a severe correction, a bear market would change his attitude towards this right away. Assuming, of course, the president of Mexico and the premier of Canada don't get together and say, hey, we're going to do what we can. What do you need us to show you that we're stopping the illegal transport of fentanyl and other drugs across the border? And please, can you do something about your consumers?
Ed, I can't let this go. I just can't. It's prime minister, not premier.
My apologies.
And the Canadian government, in its press release around its retaliatory package, uh, said that the entire amount of fentanyl seized at the Canadian border last year was 19 pounds, and it was
Yes.
three. I forget. It was some very very large number on the southern border with Mexico. So somebody maybe brought it over in a backpack. Who knows? But anyway, Ed, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights as always.
My pleasure. I look forward to talking to you soon.
So I think the discussion with Ed about the oil and gas system and the effect of Canadian tariffs on it, whatever they might be, is that this is chaos. I mean, there are any number of ways that consumers can be hurt, that the industry, oil and gas industry, can be hurt, and we'll see what happens with electricity. I mean, this is Trump. This is a favorite tactic of his: create chaos, manage the chaos, try to bully others into making concessions so that he comes away with a win in the negotiation. Why he did this, I'm not really sure. I don't think anybody really has a good handle because his reasons are pretty flimsy. But the what we'll watch for now is how long this takes. Is it a week? Is it a month? Is it 6 months? Is it a year? Because the longer it goes on, the graver the consequences will be, both for Canadian industries and for American industries. And of course, we hope for a speedy resolution so we can all get back to normal and not be in a trade war with the United States, our closest neighbor. So thank you, and we'll see you on Monday. And if we have any other news on the Trump tariffs, we'll happily explain it then.